and gentlemen, I am here with the one and only Anthony Iannarino to interview him about his newest book after writing 3 other really seminal sales books. I mean, they were very impactful for me. I'm just going to go through them really quickly because if you don't have them, you need to have them. The Lost Art of Closing. This isn't going to show up really well with these backgrounds. They're not good for that. But it's The Lost Art of Closing, where Anthony talks about the commitments that drive sales. Eat Their Lunch. Loved that one. Think I inhaled it for lunch, along with my bologna sandwich. And Elite Sales Strategies, which just came out. So Anthony, I got to tell you, I was like, does this guy ever sleep? Because truly, then a month later, you've got another new book, in addition to writing a blog every single day, in addition to flying all over the world, doing seminars and events, in addition to also running a staffing company. My first question to you, outside of eating their lunch, do you sleep?
7 hours every night.
Yeah.
I'm good on 7 hours. I'm awful on 5.
Is plenty.
Like you said, you were on 4 hours sleep. I couldn't do it.
Well, I had an early flight because I was visiting my son at college, but you're right. I mean, sleep is everything, and 7 is good, but boy, you have a lot of output, Anthony. And the first question I had, and I was saying before the show started that, only 18% of the people actually finish a nonfiction book. A lot of people don't realize this. Like, we have all these books on the shelf and we think we've read them, but really most people skim. And I picked up your book knowing that we were going to have an interview. Truth be told, I thought I'd kind of skim it, but you had me hooked. And there were so many strategies and ideas that I realized I could use for my own team that I was transfixed by it. And I do believe it's your first real true leadership book. And I guess my biggest question I had to start, Anthony, is why now? Why did you feel that now was the time that you needed to get your book out, Leading Growth?
Well, you were with us at Outbound in 2021. So in 2021, I gave the speech on being one up. And I was afraid of the speech because I thought people might think it's manipulation or something like that. And I had already written the outline for Leading Growth. So I was going to that was going to be my 4th book. It's my 5th book. But when I gave that speech and I saw how people responded to it, the publisher said, you should write that book. And I thought, I'm already writing a book. Okay, but maybe I'll just change the order. So I wrote Elite Sales Strategies because I thought it was the book that salespeople needed right now. It's very practical, tactical, and philosophical in some way, but that book got written. And then when you write a book and you publish with a publisher, they take a long time to do everything. They just take a long time. So it's like 6 months from the time I turn it in till the book comes out. So what are you going to do? You might as well just go ahead and write another book. And so I wrote the other book, and this one's going to come out on September 21st at Outbound. So that's kind of a nice thing. And I'm thinking, what am I going to do in between? I might as well write another book. And just to maybe tell you a little bit more, I'm now writing another book because I've been waiting for this one to come out. So I've already started on book number 6 right now. So that one's and it's not a sales book and it's not a leadership book. It's my first wide book, wide audience. So I wrote this because—
And your work is I believe the reason that I've always been so impressed with you, Anthony, and so inspired by you. And I joke that you're the smartest guy in sales, but it's not a joke. You're very curious along a broad spectrum of work, philosophy, anthropology. And I believe that so many sales authors, it's like Mexican food, right? They're just saying the same thing. Like a burrito is the same thing as a taco, is a, it's all the same stuff, right? Sort of the meat, the chicken, the cheese, it's the same ingredients. But you come at this from a much more holistic perspective, which makes your writing really impactful. And I never thought of you just as a sales author. Both you and Jill Conrath, I put in that vein. where you both are such strong writers because you're so well read and so curious into other endeavors that it makes your writing much richer for the salespeople and sales leaders that read it.
Thank you for saying that. I will just tell you, I wrote this because if you get to spend time with sales managers or sales leaders, you know how hard that job is. Like you could just hear when they talk about the challenges that they have. And I mean, it's hard to manage a team anyway, no matter what the size of the team, it's difficult. But when you have this constant goal sitting in front of you, and you have to get that goal by having other people do the work that when you were in that role, you did that work and you were successful. And somebody said, you should be a sales leader. And you're like, yeah, that sounds good. And then you find out like nothing is in your control. You have this team, they're doing all the things right that you think they need to do. And it's still hard. It's hard to forecast. It's hard to communicate. It's hard to share the vision. But all of these things that I noticed that people struggle with, what I wanted to write was a comprehensive view. So the first book that I ever wrote was The Only Sales Guide You'll Ever Need. And that was like a competency model for salespeople. So it has some mindset stuff and then it's got some skills. This one I just did skills. And it was just because like, how do you get practical, tactical so that you can get the results that you need? And this book is really about creating net new revenue growth. That's what the book is about. That's why the name is Leading Growth. That's what you do. And I thought it was important to give them a comprehensive book instead of just taking like one chapter and expanding it. So the reason people don't read nonfiction books all the way to the end is because a lot of books that we read, and I read a lot of books, I buy a lot of books, sometimes it's really 3 chapters and then a lot of repetition. So we're all guilty of repeating ourselves because we have to. Like there's themes that you need to keep touching. But I think it's really important to give people a comprehensive view of how to be a sales manager, how to be a sales leader, and how to communicate and how to make sure that your team is doing the right things at the right time in the right way so you can succeed and grow your revenue.
And Anthony, will you just repeat for the audience, for those who haven't read your book yet, and we'll put in the show notes how to get your book so that the audience can be first to get your book when it comes out on September 21st, assuming they're not at Outbound. If they are at Outbound, I'm sure they can even get a signed copy there, which would be amazing. And for those people who are living under a rock and don't know about Outbound, perhaps we will put that in the show notes. But my question, could you just tell the audience what that revenue formula is? It's simple.
It's
but if
so
you're not
simple.
doing it, it's advanced, right? I mean,
it's so simple and it's so hard. So it's like the idea is super easy. Executing it is very hard. So the growth formula works like this. You take your existing revenue that you know you have going into a quarter or a year, whatever it is. So whatever period of time you're trying to plan for. And then you remove your churn. So that's something that people don't generally do. They're like, we did $10 million. Next year, we're going to do $12 million. Not remembering that they're going to churn, say, $2.5 million. Okay, so you first have to get $2.5 million to get back to 0. And then you get net new revenue. And the net new revenue is going to be your growth. So you have to replace the churn and then start generating net new revenue. So when you say it that way, it sounds really easy. I take this number that I have, I reduce it by the churn, and then I say, well, I'm going to put $5 million on top of that. If it was only that easy, but a lot of things have to go right for you to do that. And the formula is easy, but the execution of it tends to be very difficult for sales managers. And I would describe a sales manager's role as one of the more difficult business roles that you can occupy. It's very difficult. I mean, there's a lot of people that have to do the work for them. So there's a lot of leaders, but we're working against a clock. And look, if you're in an operations role and you're a leader, you don't have other companies trying to take your clients away from you. And you're not having to compete for the work that you do inside your own building. But everything that we do is a competition, and there's a lot of things that are moving parts, and it's difficult. And now you know this because you talk about it as much as I do. buyers are having a tough time doing this. So it's even hard to get the buyer to even engage in the way that they need to right now. So we're in a different time. It's a very difficult time for people. And so they're uncertain. They're not sure about what they can do. So it's very difficult for them to engage and very difficult for them to move forward. So our job is to make sure that we have teams that can do this and handle those kinds of conversations. That shows up in the book, as you know, in a chapter on effectiveness. It's very important that we get effective and we're able to help people the way they need to be helped right now.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. We say all the time today, it's not a selling problem, it's a buying problem, and it's a confidence problem. At the end of the day, that we really have to instill confidence because of the complexity of the buying committees. I always love the saying, a camel is a horse made by committee. I just love that saying, and it's so true today, right? I mean, we've got so much complexity, not only more stakeholders, but the diversity of the stakeholders, and then the sheer amount of information that they're taking in that I guess it paralyzes the buyer.
Yeah, you could, when you think about why they're struggling right now, it's generally because if I make a mistake, I could actually make it worse. And I know the devil that I know right now, but I don't need any new devils that I'm not sure of how to deal with. We figured out how to survive, and let's just wait it out. So for a lot of people, it's just, I can't make a decision. I'm just going to wait this out, which is probably the worst decision that they could make.
You know, I'd love to get your take on this. I just saw Matt Dixon or heard him on a podcast. He's got a new book, Jolt, and he said something really interesting. He said, you know, in his research, and I'm sure you've heard this because you're up on everything, but he said it's not so much that buyers are reverting to the status quo, although that's still a factor. It's that they have a fear of making a mistake, which is actually different. Because if I'm a buyer, I can say, yeah, like you said, I'm just going to stay where I am. You know, and I know I need to change. I'm just not going to do it now because I don't want to make a mistake, which is really different than status quo. Yeah, it's a cousin, but it's different. What's your feeling on that, Anthony?
I think that that's right. And in Elite Sales Strategies, I wrote that there's a certainty sequence. And the certainty sequence is, I was trying to teach people that they get it backwards. They're like, let me tell you how good we are so that you can be certain to buy from us and that you know you'll get the results. Well, that's exactly wrong. So first, it's the certainty of negative consequences. So you have to give them the negative consequences. And then later on, you have to give them the certainty that they are going to be able to produce the positive outcomes that they need. But we tend to get that backwards. And now we really need to get like, there is a reason for you to change. You are going to continue to struggle. You may end up in even worse trouble than you are right now. And then we have to teach them, these are the things that if you do these things, you will be able to get the positive results. And that's the certainty sequence. They're uncertain and everybody's uncertain. Like, how can you not be in this environment? You know, you've got inflation, supply chain issues, pandemics, war in Ukraine, energy problems, like the list goes on and on, right? So how can you be certain when you have all these moving pieces?
Yeah, exactly. Now you said something that I want to put a highlight into. You said something about this is intrigues. You always intrigue me, Anthony. You said something about that you've got to know you've got to tell them the negative consequences first. Now, I know we're going back to your previous book, but can you just elaborate on that a little bit for our audience?
Yeah, so one of the things that I tried to do with that book, so far it's been helpful for people, is to just remove a lot of the legacy approach, which is, let me tell you, our company's great. You can trust us. I'm credible because my company's credible. Let me tell you about our clients. Let me tell you about our solution. And this is all like trying to say, we're good and you should buy from us. It's so early in the conversation. It's all wrong. It comes way later. I mean, it's important that you do this, just not at the beginning. It's a bad first date. Like, I'm wonderful. You're going to love me. We should probably get married. We should have children. Like, we just sat down, like we haven't talked to each other very much yet. So we don't know anything. And they really want to understand like what's going on. How should I interpret these things? Why do I have these poor results? And I wanted to erase that for people so they could just immediately start creating value in the conversation.
I love it. Now, you said something in leading growth, and I wrote it down here. You had this fabulous list of external and internal challenges to growth. And, we've been talking really about the external challenges, the challenge of consensus, the challenge of too much information, the challenge of uncertainty. And I love the list of both. I thought that was very powerful. Which do you find to be more debilitating, the internal or the external challenges?
I think the internals are because of the external in a large part. So when you start looking at how buyers buy and how they're struggling and how they need consensus, and many of them believe consensus means unanimous decision, which they're not going to get. Like, not everybody can go along. And when you start to see that, then that shows up in our world, as a very difficult problem for us to solve. How do you help not a decision maker? And I'm going to confess that I'm old enough that I called on decision makers, like literally. I walked into a room and I sat down with a CEO or a president. I pitched them. They signed a contract and I left with a deal. It was a beautiful, beautiful time. Like, it was so straightforward.
You and me
And
both, buddy.
it was so fast.
good
Like, you
old
just
days.
walk in, you do your job and you leave with a contract, and
I
it was
know.
great. And then all of a sudden, 2001, then 2008 and 9, and then this period that we've been in now, another disruption. And it seems it's harder and harder for people because it is getting more uncertain all the time. Eventually we'll pass through this, but right now, sales managers need a lot of help. They need a lot of help communicating with their teams, helping them understand why we're doing some of these things, and giving them the competencies so that they can be effective enough to do the work that they need to do. It's a hard job right now.
Yeah,
Both of them, managing
when
and
you were
selling.
saying that, I was remembering the first time I met somebody at a conference. We had done some business before, and I remember meeting him at a conference, and I knew he loved caviar and vodka. And it was 5 o'clock in the afternoon, so I had the hotel bring in, because I knew I had a big deal here. I said, can you bring in some of that, not the most expensive caviar, but the caviar and the Stoli. Back then, Stoli was the vodka. And we're just yucking it up. And he's like, yeah, absolutely. We're going to do another deal together. And this, that, and the other. It's a, strong 6-figure deal. And then all of a sudden, we get back and I call his number 2 guy and he totally blows the deal. And this is only a second guy. And at that point, I thought, I got to write a deal called selling to number 2. But now it's like selling to number 11,
Yeah.
right? Like you're right. It's boy, those good old days. Anthony, I have a question here. You beautifully craft the vision that you have for your own company.
Yeah.
You mentioned strategies like you're more expensive. I guess you're the Neiman Marcus of training, that you deliver more value, and you're very adept at communicating that to your team. Now, this is a selfish question because I'm trying to reconcile this with my own organization. What does a leader do, a sales leader or any leader do, when you're very clear about your vision, and yet you have somebody on your team, they ascribe to your values, so they're a good hire, they're a high performer, but their vision isn't necessarily your vision, and it's hard to make a link?
Those are hard ones. Those are difficult ones to do, but you have to do something about it. So if you're the one that has the vision, your team has to have that vision too. They're not allowed to have a separate vision. And so you have to work very hard. So I used a couple strategies in the book, one about transformation. And then in that particular thing, this is a true story. I was sitting outside of a meeting I was getting ready to go into, and I wondered why don't we have more literature? That's too big of a word. Why don't we have more writing about enrollment? Like, how do you get people to enroll in your vision? And at that time, I reached out to Seth Godin and I said, where can I read about enrollment? I mean, I can't find anything that's significant. And he said, there isn't anything. And I said, would you write something for me? And if you could do that by like noon, that'd be really helpful for me. And at about noon, he sent me a blog post that he published the next day.
Wow. There's so many wows in this statement. Okay, go ahead.
And so I took his writing And then I built it into rules for enrollment, and I sent it to him. And I said, what am I missing? And he gave me 3 of them that showed up in the list in there. And I realized, like, he's a guy who cares enough that he doesn't want compliance. He wants commitment, and commitment means you have to enroll people. So your standout person that has their own vision is going to take some work for you. You're going to have to explain, like, this is why this vision matters right now. At some point in the future, we'll have another vision, but this vision I need you to enroll in, and I don't want you to be compliant. I want you to be committed, because this is where we're going. And so if you only say that one time, you didn't say it at all. Like, literally, they didn't hear it. Every day you have to go back over the vision until people believe it's true. They will not believe it's true if you stop communicating it. As soon as you stop, they're like, we can wait Shari out. She'll have another thing. She always has another idea. Just give her like 5-7 minutes. She's going to tell us that there's something else that's
Are you listening in on
important.
my Zoom calls, Anthony?
I just know how creatives are. Like, it's like, I love this, and you know what? I love that, and I love the other thing. And it's very hard for them. They do want to outweight you. Your team generally wants to outweight you because they've seen you get hyped up about Challenger. And then the next year, it's like, we're hyped up about back to basics. And now we're marketing, like, focused. Like, you know, you're confusing everybody. Just pick one thing and stick with it until you get it all the way across the line. And you get to do what I do. So you go speak to companies. And if you go to the same company like 3 years in a row, you're like, they never did the first thing that they said they were going to do. So you just have to stick. They go like,
So
you're
true.
not going to do this. So I can just, whatever
Right.
they say here isn't going to
I'm
matter.
hired for life, right?
Yeah.
I remember early on in my career, I had to say, when I first became a sales manager and knew nothing about management, was actually a horrible manager for the first year or so. I remember I was in charge of training, which was appropriate. And I said, okay, here's, 10 things we need to train on. What happens when I'm done with these 10? And he looks at me and he says, you start over.
Yeah, exactly.
You start over, because by the time you're at 8, they forgot 1. And you're absolutely right, that you've got to get the vision out there. And I think, as you say in your book, and in many different ways, right?
Yeah.
And there's stories, there's data, there's many different ways. And can you jump into that right now, what you talk about in Leading Growth, about how do you say the same thing in 5 different ways?
Well,
I love
you read the book, so I'll just tell the story.
Yeah.
I was on a plane with a guy named David Speakman, who was the CEO of a company called Travel Counselors. He was the founder. And we went all around the world, and I spoke to all of his teams in Europe and Africa and Australia. We went everywhere together. And we were on a flight, and he was sitting next to me, and he said, I say the same thing over and over again. And I said, yeah, and it's perfect. It's working for you. And he said, do you think I should change my speech? And I said, absolutely not. You've convinced 1,000 travel people that they're not travel agents, they're travel counselors. And they work at home and they have their own franchise, and they're creating a greater level of value. Like, you can never stop saying this, because as soon as you stop saying this, they're going to think it's not true anymore. So get 10% more every year to believe that this is true. Just get 10% more, but change the stories, change the data.
Yes.
Change the action that you want somebody to do, but don't change the message. Like, this is the vision, and you got everybody going the same way. Don't mess it up. And that was helpful for him. It's helpful for all leaders. Like, you have to find new ways to say the same thing so that you're not boring and repetitive, even though you are going to be repeating yourself quite a bit.
But that's so true. It's different stories, different examples, and different stories and different examples. And then that sort of leads me to my next question. You said something great. It was later in the book about how, when you're instilling the vision in the team, that the best thing you can do with naysayers is have them teach it and have them say it, which I guess is another way of saying the same thing, right?
Yeah.
Okay, hey, Alan, You teach it, and I love this. This is always the most powerful thing you can do. But can you tell a story about how you have leveraged that either in your own company or with a client? Because that's just epic.
I've done it multiple times. So the naysayers are the ones now you have to understand it's good for them to be skeptical.
Yes.
Okay, so that's good. And other people are skeptical too. So when you take the skeptic or the cynic sometimes, hopefully not a cynic, but maybe skeptical, okay, and you say, listen, people look at you as a leader. They're not going to adopt this unless you do. So I need you to have this communication with them. And I need you to be a leader here so people understand what we're doing is good and right and true. So I'm going to ask you to have these conversations with this team because they look up to you. Now, okay, so it's very hard. I'm trying to put them in a box, right? And then once we get them in the box, we put a lid on it and then we pound some hammers and nails there so that they're stuck in that box because you're my ambassador now. It's a fun thing to do if you haven't done it. It doesn't make the other person particularly happy because they're still skeptical. But the more you talk to them, the more you're going to convert them. You can't ever stop with your message. You can't. You have to constantly get back on your vision, tell everybody why it's important, what's expected of them, raise the bar and get everybody to commit. That's the goal of a leader.
Love that, Anthony.
It's
Love
really
that.
interesting because somebody asked me to write the difference between a manager and a leader, and that's part of it. Like the leader raises the standard. The manager just checks to make sure you're doing the work and do the forecast and have their meetings with you. It's a very different role. But when you're a leader, your job is to make sure everybody is aligned and that you are working towards your real vision.
Yeah, absolutely. Which leads me to my next question. You talk about transformation in your book, and about how sellers must change. And of course, we're selling change to customers. I mean, without change, there's no sale. You talk about that a lot. I talk about that a lot. And of course, change means getting out of your comfort zone completely. Yet I find salespeople really more than anybody else, or it's hard for them to get out of their own comfort zone, right? So here we are as sellers asking our clients to change, to get out of their comfort zone, to do something completely different, yet we won't get out of our own. How do you move a seller out of their comfort zone? And why do you think it's so damn hard for them to do it? Us. I'm going to say us.
Us, yeah, we're an us. In the book, I wrote this, like if you go to a group of salespeople and you ask them, should your clients change so they can get better results? And they'll all say yes. And then if you say, do you think our company should change? And they're going to give you a giant list of things that don't include any change on their side at all, right? It's like all these other things should be done different. Like we should have lower pricing, like we should have better customer success, all these other things. They'll have a whole bunch of things.
They're all external,
And,
right?
Yeah. And then you say something like, well, what do you think we need to change? Nothing. We're doing great. Like, that can't be true because you go out every day and see companies where there's always more potential, right? So we have to figure out how to have a conversation about what's our full potential. And so when you start talking about when salespeople don't want to change, it's the craziest thing. Like we should be the ones that are capable of changing because we help other people do it. But it's easier when it's another person. When it's you and you recognize that you're the obstacle, that's a very different problem to solve. And for all of us as leaders, I would just tell you the very first thing that you have to adopt as your number one idea is that everything is your fault as the leader. And then you have to help other people realize that everything is their fault too. It wasn't the competitor that beat them. It wasn't the fact that somebody had a lower price. It's none of those things. It's that you didn't win it. And if you don't believe that that's true, then how can you ever get better? Like if you lose, then you get a lesson. So that's it. There's an L for loser or L for lesson. I like the L for lesson. Like you didn't lose anything. You're going to go back after them and you're going to do it in a smarter way and you're going to win them at the end of the next contract. So that's it. But we do have to continually talk to them about the changes. And the ones that are really difficult for people right now that I have in this book and in the prior book is the effectiveness. And the legacy approach is just not helping people anymore. I have more people coming to me to tell me we can't get from a first meeting to a second meeting. And what that means is they didn't find the first meeting valuable. So
Exactly.
we're moving on. And if your first meeting is the same first meeting that you've had since Shari and I were selling to a decision maker, a single decision maker, which makes her smile, right? Because it was so good. It was fast.
So
It
good.
was
And
easy.
the caviar was good too.
But if you have to help these people change, you have to have these conversations about what's important to the client right now. And really this uncertainty, they need somebody to come in and educate them and enlighten them into what I would describe as a paradigm shift. Like you have to get rid of their past beliefs and all the things that were good for them when they made a decision 10 years ago. But now it's a different time. And now they have to get updated assumptions, and they have to have this paradigm shift where they understand what reality looks like right now.
And I am completely with you on that, Anthony. It's not teaching them something new. It's unteaching them something that they thought they knew, right? Which is really requires a real heightened amount of skill and knowledge and strategy. My question for you is, I get that, you know, people that have the sophistication and have the knowledge, that's something that we all need to aspire to. Now, what about the SDR model? Like, how do you get an SDR to operate at that level, or do you not? How do you view that?
I feel bad for SDRs. I don't think it's a good, for a lot of companies, I don't think it's a good thing for them. Now, I will tell you, I do think that many of them are going to be very good salespeople in the future for one reason. They're not afraid of the phone. They're on the phone all the time. So they're really good at the phone. And they have a bunch of people that publish on LinkedIn, like Jason Bay. Like he's constantly giving people real strategies for getting people on the phone and keeping them on the phone and converting it into a meeting. That's a really important thing. But if they're not allowed to see what happens after the beginning, you know, so it's like, I got this meeting, I had a tiny bit of discovery, and now I hand it off to this person, and I'm not part of that, then how am I ever going to learn what that part looks like? So I always think that they should be included in every conversation that they booked so that they can listen to somebody have this conversation, and then that will improve their effectiveness eventually. And they really do need to find a way, like there needs to be a bridge to get them into, even if it's a mid-roll before they get to that field rep role, but they need to be on that path. It's hard to help them. They can be effective and they can get all the insights that they need to do that. But if they're just in this one little box, it's not good for them. They're going to get really good at one thing. It'd be like just doing biceps on one side of your body, right? So you just keep lifting weights and then you got a big bicep over here and then little skinny arms on the other side. It's not good. You want to be balanced, and they should be full cycle salespeople at some point in the future. They should take care of the whole conversation.
Yeah, not everybody's gonna make it to the double bicep lane, probably.
No, not unless they get forced to.
Yes, yes. All right, then in part 2 on taking the lead, where you talk about taking the lead, you talk about how the sales approach must be consistent. I love this line, or it's like circus lemonade. I don't know where you come up with that stuff, but I haven't been to a circus lately, but I can only imagine what circus lemonade tastes like
It's a little watery.
old cotton candy or something.
Yeah, it's not very good. And you
No.
wouldn't expect it to be very good because you're at a circus.
Yeah.
It's weak. So the legacy approach is just weak, and it doesn't create any value. And because it doesn't create any value, all you're doing is just wasting the client's time. And it's very difficult. Like, of all the changes we've asked people to make, this change seems to be a very difficult one. And I think there's a couple reasons. And I hope that when readers read this, I hope they understand this. If that still worked, it would be great. And the reason that they wish it still worked is because that's what they know. They know solution selling. They know why us. They know that it worked for them, and it worked. I mean, let's be clear. The legacy approaches worked in their time. They did work. I did this. Like I used solution selling I liked it. It worked for me until it didn't work for me anymore. And then you start to realize like something's changed. I remember the first time I walked into an office and I had a meeting and there were 14 people sitting in there. This is 2001, 14 people sitting in the room, and they introduced themselves as the task force. And I'm like, there's 14 of them. Like, what am I going to do with
And it was just
14
you,
people?
14-1?
Yeah, they were totally outgunned and outnumbered, but they didn't know that at first. It took them a while to recognize that I knew what I was talking about. I had another one shortly after that where there were over 20 people in a room, and I was sitting at like a 7th grade desk at the front of this room with these people surrounding me.
They put you in the little desk and they were on the, like that wasn't subliminal at all.
I just smiled because I thought, like, they asked me to come in.
Yeah,
I didn't
right.
ask to come in to talk to them. They came in to me and asked me, would you come in and talk to us? So I thought, okay. And it worked out perfectly. It was $1 million.
Beautiful. Beautiful. So I have so many more questions, but we're running out of time, Anthony. I do want to ask 2 more questions. Number one, when you talk about accountability, you also say how you do one thing is how you do everything. And as a longtime yogi, they always say how you are on the mat is how you are in life.
Yeah.
Which is a little disconcerting since it's hard for me to stay on the mat for 90 minutes. So it's always a little disconcerting, but what do you think leaders have to do to hold themselves accountable so that we can hold our sellers accountable? What are 3 to 5 tips you talk about in the
So
book?
they're just one. Like, you have to be the leader that your team needs. That's what you have to be. So I was on a plane ride with a guy who was sitting next to me, and like, he's crisp. I mean, crisp. Like, he's totally buttoned up. Everything about him tells you that this guy he's a killer. There's no doubt about it. And he's a sales leader. And the word crisp came from him. He said, I only hire salespeople that are crisp. And I said, what does crisp mean? And then I looked at him and I'm like, never mind. It looks like this. His team is what your team will be for you. And they're going to be a reflection of you. And this is Emerson. So Emerson said, every organization is the shadow of one man. That's what he said. So Emerson's not very wrong on this one. Like, they're going to be what you are. You're buttoned up, you're disciplined, you're chasing the vision, you're communicating well, you're making sure that everything is going the way it's supposed to. So right thing, right time, right way. You do that, and that's what your team will be. If you don't, and you're like, I'm going to neglect them a little bit, I'm going to spend more time internally instead of with my team, you won't get that same result. So I think that if I could leave you with the word, it would be crisp, and then be what they need you to be and be that example for them so they can look at that and say, this is what I need to be.
Crisp, not crisper, crisp.
Just crisp.
Crisp. Love that word. It's crisp. It's beautiful. No, I could see the gentleman sitting next to you. The last question I have for you, Anthony, you talk about hiring for character over skills.
Yeah.
And I always loved in the book on character, David Brooks' book, where he talks about eulogy virtues and resume virtues. And,
Yeah.
and that really stuck out to me. And I absolutely, we're in so much philosophical agreement on this. My question to you for the sales leaders that are watching this is, what are some methods that a sales leader can use for hiring? And I'm sure this is a whole separate podcast or interview, but just 1 or 2 tips. How do leaders hire based on values and not just skills?
Yeah, I want character traits. So somebody put a link, or they put a comment on a LinkedIn post where I had the cover and I wrote down what the 14 competencies are. And he challenged me by saying, like, where's honesty and integrity? Well, that's a character trait. I was writing skills in this book. And if I had to teach somebody character traits like honesty and integrity, if I had to do that, I would not be happy that I had to ever do that with any human being that I hired. So I care deeply about the character traits and the mindset of the individual because I can teach them the skills. So you're always going to hire. So this is just my view. You're always going to hire their weaknesses. So you get some of their strengths, but you also get their weaknesses. Which weaknesses would you want to live with? Would you want to live with somebody who has no integrity? Would you want to live with somebody who's not disciplined and they can't make themselves do their own work? Would you want to live with somebody who has a bad attitude? So the things that you're checking for are these character traits. If they say, I need to get a better approach for getting a meeting, we can teach you that. That I can teach you. But what you didn't get when you were young or you had some adaptation that makes you a difficult person because you don't have any of these character traits, you don't want that. You don't want that. You want somebody who's got good character, somebody who's going to be a self-starter. The number one for me is hunger. I like hungry people, not starving people. That's not good, but I want hungry people. They want something. They know what they want, and they're going to be self-starters. So those are the things that I look for, but I want the character traits in a very, very large amount.
I love that. You want somebody hungry enough to eat their lunch, but
Yes,
not hungry enough to steal it
right.
or
Exactly.
something like that. There's
Yeah.
some metaphor there.
Yeah, I don't
Anthony
want-
Iannarino, Leading Growth. What a phenomenal book. Congratulations, Anthony. How can people get a hold of you? We're obviously going to put the book in the show notes, but for the sales leaders out there that want to work with you, that want to work with your team, again, folks, people ask me all the time, who's my favorite sales author, who's one of my favorite sales leaders. You've got him right here, right now. I have learned so much from Anthony Iannarino. But again, Anthony, what impresses me most about you is again, your thoughtfulness, your integrity, and your holistic approach. That to you, it's not just about sales, it's really about living a better life. And that shines through in everything you do and in every conversation we have. So thank you for that. And how can people get a hold of you?
The best place to find me is thesalesblog.com and then LinkedIn. LinkedIn's a great place.
Awesome. Ladies and gentlemen, Anthony Iannarino. Thank you, Anthony.
We're going to have to talk about when I come to Park City.
Let me look at my calendar.
I think it's the 26th.